The first light of morning crept over the battered rooftops of Kut al-Amara, revealing streets coated in dust, splintered boards, and the dark stains left by night shelling a British sentry crouched behind a half-collapsed wall, his uniform stiff with dirt, watching the Tigris River crawl past like a sluggish brown vein. Across the far bank, Ottoman guns adjusted their angles. A moment later, a thin whistle cut through the air. He braced before the shell hit, sending a plume of debris into the sky and rattling what remained of the nearby houses. The siege had begun another day, and inside Kut, no one had enough strength left to pretend things were normal. Months earlier, the British had marched into Mesopotamia with a confidence that evaporated the moment their advance stalled near Ctesiphon. The fighting there had been brutal, the heat suffocating, and the retreat that followed brought them limping back to Kut. General Charles Townshend chose the river town as his fortress, believing he could hold it until reinforcements arrived. The men dug trenches, fortified stone buildings, and rationed what supplies they had, trusting London would not allow them to starve. December brought the first tightening of the noose. Ottoman forces dug in around the river bend, sealing the town from every direction. Nothing moved along the roads except Turkish patrols. The river was watched so closely that even attempting to fetch driftwood risked sniper fire. Inside Kut, soldiers tried to maintain routine. They drilled weekly in the streets, repaired roofs shattered by artillery, and loaded their rifles with hands that trembled more from hunger than fear. January brought sickness. The garrison shrank into itself as men collapsed with dysentery, fever, and the bone-deep ache of scurvy. Fresh food no longer existed. Salted meat turned rancid in its barrels. Flour crawled with insects. Rats became a resource. A pot of onion stew, if anyone had onions, was worth more than gold. Men ate grass, boiled leather straps, chewed rope fibers until their gums bled. Everything that could be burned was burned, leaving the town coated in ash and desperation. Every week, the sound of aircraft overhead brought brief hope. But the airdrops failed more often than they succeeded. Crates drifted off course and thudded into Ottoman trenches. Others splashed into the river and were lost instantly. One crate landed perfectly in the town square, filled with boots. By March, Kut had become a skeleton of a settlement. Windows shattered, doors ripped from hinges, trenches filled with sewage when the river rose. Yet the men still waited, telling themselves each day must be the one when the relief column arrived. But every attack along the Tigris failed. Gunboats were sunk. Floods slowed the advance. Entire units were chewed apart attempting to break the cordon. Each failure hit Kut harder than the shells. When dawn rose on April 29, 1916, the town could no longer pretend. Starvation had hollowed the ranks. Disease had taken more than the bombardment. No help was coming. Townshend surrendered the garrison, nearly 13,000 soldiers and camp followers, and the Ottomans marched in with tight discipline, collecting weapons and herding the exhausted survivors into groups. For many in Kut, surrender felt like a kind of mercy. But within hours, it became clear their suffering was only changing shape. The Ottoman Empire was stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, short on supplies, transport animals, and rations. They needed to move the prisoners north quickly, and they intended to do it with whatever resources they had, no matter how inadequate. Lines of prisoners, already weak from starvation, were ordered to march out of Kut under a rising sun. Officers were separated and transported by boat and rail. Enlisted men, Indian troops, laborers, and camp workers were formed into columns and sent onto the desert roads with hardly any food or water. Some staggered the moment they tried to step forward. Others leaned on their comrades, legs shaking from months of malnutrition. The heat was brutal. It pressed down like a weight, turning the road into a shimmering band of white. Men marched with tongues swollen, lips cracked open, sweat evaporating faster than their bodies could produce it. Water became the most valuable substance in the world. At some stops, they received a single ladleful. At others, there was nothing. Men cupped their hands for drops they couldn't see. Some bent low to sip from irrigation ditches and were beaten back by guards who shouted at them to keep moving. Food barely existed, a handful of flour, a crust of coarse bread. Some days, nothing at all. Prisoners gnawed on weeds and dry twigs for moisture. Hunger drove some to scrape seeds from the ground and swallow them whole. Their bodies were too weak to protest. The march grew worse by the day. Sandstorms rose without warning, forcing men to pull their shirts over their faces and stumble blindly for miles. Many Indian soldiers, weakened and targeted by harsher treatment, collapsed frequently. Some were beaten to their feet. Others were left where they fell. British soldiers watched helplessly as men who had stood by their side at Kut now lay motionless in the dust, the column forced to march past them. Disease followed like a shadow. Dysentery left men dehydrated within hours. Fever blurred vision. Some prisoners walked as if in a dream, muttering names of family, trying to remember what cold water tasted like. Others marched until their legs suddenly buckled, dropping without warning. A few were lifted by friends who refused to leave them behind, but the weight of a man who could no longer walk often meant both would soon fall. The distances were staggering. Groups marched hundreds of miles across blistering flats, rocky passes, and barren plains. Boots wore down to thin layers of leather, then to nothing. Some wrapped their bleeding feet in cloth torn from their own shirts. Others walked barefoot, leaving streaks of blood on the stones behind them. Guards shouted, prodded, and pushed the pace. The Ottoman army had little patience for prisoners who slowed the column. By the time survivors reached camps in Ras Al Ain, Aleppo, and farther north, they were emaciated, sunburned, many unable to stand. Thousands never arrived. They died along the road, in makeshift way stations, or in the first nights inside overcrowded camps. The march claimed more lives than the siege itself. For the survivors, Kut became more than a battle or a surrender. It became the memory of endless sand under their boots, the sound of men collapsing beside them, the hollow ache of thirst that never eased, and the knowledge that their suffering continued long after the guns fell silent. Years after the war ended, those who lived rarely spoke of the march in detail. But when they did, their voices carried the weight of a hardship no victory or treaty could erase. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.